Right, for more of this, I'm joined now by Equal Education Parliamentary Officer Jane Borman. Jane, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. Let's start right there with how you
Thanks
were
for having
kicked
me.
out in Parliament today. The extent of the use of force in kicking you out, but also what is the reasoning that you were given?
So it was a little bit confusing, considering that at that point they'd already removed the majority of people who came together to Grand Parade. At the point at which I got there were only about 5 of us sort of standing within Ruland Street. But they indicated that they're based on the disaster management regulations, anywhere within the precinct of Parliament, people were unable to congregate. But then on top of that, if they let individuals walk past or walk in the area that they didn't seem to think were affiliated with perhaps a protest around Parliament. But yeah, we were walked from Ruland Street, just outside Parliament, all the way to the Grand Parade, which truly was excessive.
Yeah. Talk to me about why you decided to march to Parliament, and you had a look at what the budget was saying, or at least what you predicted would come out of the budget. And what was your concern?
So our deep concern is that COVID-19 saw really drastic budget cuts to basic education. In terms of the budget that was then released, although they have reversed, they've not reversed the budget cuts that were made last year, but some of the funding has returned to pre-COVID-19 levels. The picture is still looking pretty bleak for basic education. So many of our demands, or one of our key demands, was that we are requiring progressive funding for basic education, which means that it must keep up with inflation and be funded enough to allow all learners to meaningfully complete their basic education.
So are you saying it's just merely not enough for government to say, well, a bulk of our budget actually goes to this function, which is the learning function, and basic education actually is the biggest chunk of it?
Yes. So basic education does take up a large chunk of the learning and culture budget, but often the learning and culture budget is referred to in place of basic education, without realizing that basic education actually is a smaller percentage of it. We are now looking at both the total basic education budget and the budget to the Department of Basic Education declining in real terms, so that's when inflation is taken into account, over the next 3 years looking forward. Although there's been a slight increase in funding this year compared to the COVID-19 cuts, looking forward, we're still quite concerned with what we see.
What are the implications of this fiscal policy? I mean, the minister explains our fiscus position. He says we owe a lot of money to a lot of people, and therefore we are adopting this new budget framework in order to be able to pay those people that we owe. But I mean, what are the implications of that on education?
Well, one of the major implications is that at a very basic level, less and less learners are being able to complete basic education. This filters down in a number of ways. The fact that we are looking at wage freezes for teachers means that there will be less teachers, more overcrowding, which obviously impacts basic education learning outcomes. Then we also see that school infrastructure has severely deteriorated with the cuts that were seen under COVID-19. So children will continue to go to schools that are unsafe for learning and unsanitary. So at a very basic level, what it'll mean is less and less of our learners and of our children will be able to complete their basic education.
36.7 billion rands to education infrastructure. What do you make of that share and that portion that has been allocated just for infrastructure?
So we are, as you know, infrastructure, specifically the education infrastructure grant, got the largest grant cut of any during COVID-19 across all sectors. So we are very thankful that we are again seeing similar funding as pre-COVID. However, obviously, there are a lot of underlying issues, specifically the fact that with the wage sector freeze, that means that there'll be less capacity in departments and perhaps less ability to implement projects. So we are concerned about that. Unfortunately, these school infrastructure grants do have a history of underspending, of having some irregular expenditure. So we're definitely going to have to monitor how that money is allocated and implemented. But we are definitely relieved that the cuts to school infrastructure during COVID-19 have not continued.
So take us through then some of your demands in your memorandum that you were delivering in Parliament.
So I think the most basic and key demand is that we require basic education to be prioritized. There's a lot of rhetoric about basic education being prioritized, but the figures actually just don't match the rhetoric. Unfortunately, what we are calling for is something that is relatively basic. We need basic education funding to increase to meet the needs of the sector. We have a growing learner population, but yet we are seeing now a decrease in funding in real terms over the next 3 years. So we are basically saying we want progressive funding that keeps up with inflation and that allows learners or gives them the opportunity to meaningfully complete their basic education. Another one of our key demands is obviously that the minimum norms and standards, which is a regulation that outlines the minimum infrastructure that each school has, must be met. The issues around school infrastructure in terms of ensuring that there is water, sanitation is an absolute essential. And we just continuously are delaying the reaching our targets. And that's something that we are really wanting to push, that not only money is going to infrastructure, but that we are building capacity to be able to actually implement these projects.
Right.
Lastly, one of our key demands is also for the National School Nutrition Program to have increased funding currently, as it is having to deal with much more costs coming through as a result of having to feed learners at home versus at school.
Jane, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us tonight. Equal Education Parliamentary Officer there, Jane Borman.